1752. Dark case. Two brothers, run-ins, robbed and murdered hundreds of people. In the summer of 1752, along a remote road in the Appalachian Mountains of colonial Virginia, investigators for the British authorities discovered something that would sow terror across the frontier for decades. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the Blackthorn Inn were leather-bound ledgers containing the names, descriptions, and estimated fortunes of over 80 merchants. Beside each entry, written in a careful Scottish hand, were notes that would make any magistrate shudder. Suggested route: Shadow Ridge Trail. Survival probability: none. Silver recovered: £5,000. The last entry, dated just weeks before the discovery, read, Benjamin Whitaker, young fur trader, traveling alone, carries silver and goods of great value. Malcolm grew impatient. Angus said, "Once this is done, we'll have enough to become great landowners in Carolina." What the authorities uncovered at that remote inn would expose the most brutal, organized murder conspiracy in colonial America, a network of corruption whose tentacles reached into the nascent heart of power in Virginia. The Fletcher brothers' story begins not with their crimes, but with the land that bred them. The wild, rugged Appalachian Mountains of the 18th century, where the authority of the crown was faint and local law was a thing decided by the barrel of a gun. In 1752, Virginia was in a state of simmering chaos. Wars with native peoples and border disputes had left deep scars. Bands of bandits and deserters hid in the dense forests, ready to prey on anyone. Merchants and settlers, many of them immigrants from Scotland and Ireland, seeking opportunity in furs and land, struggled to survive on their own in a land that always watched them with a suspicious eye. It was into this setting that Angus and Malcolm Fletcher arrived in 1748, two brothers from the Scottish Highlands who had fled their homeland after accusations of robbery. Angus, the 5-year-old elder brother, a veteran of the colonial wars, possessed a sharp mind for business and a silver tongue that could win the trust of the most suspicious merchants. Malcolm, 30, with the brawny frame of a Highland hunter, had learned from frontier skirmishes that violence, if used at the right moment, could definitively solve problems that sweet talk could not. They established their inn at a place the locals called Devil's Fork Crossroads, where the main trade road from Philadelphia intersected with the Shadow Ridge Trail, a treacherous but shorter route through the heart of the Appalachians. The location was perfect, remote enough to avoid British military patrols, yet situated at a strategic crossroads where weary merchants would gladly pay a high price for food, information, and a safe roof for the night. The Blackthorn Inn itself was an unremarkable structure, a crude log house with a wide porch and a few simple rooms for lodging. Its shelves were stocked with only basic necessities like rum, gunpowder, and salted meat. What made it special was the Fletcher brothers' ability to make every guest feel as if they were being let in on precious secrets. Angus had a talent for earning trust over a few stories and a glass of rum, while Malcolm's sullen and intimidating presence ensured that the talkative would spill their secrets and the suspicious would hold their tongues. The American colonies of the 1752 were experiencing a commercial boom. The roads became busy with merchant caravans returning from the western frontiers, carrying vast fortunes. They transported not only furs, silver, and goods, but also their entire life savings, accumulated over years of risky trade. They were wealthy, exhausted from long journeys, and completely unfamiliar with the laws that might protect them. The settlements along this route had mixed feelings about the constant flow of travelers. Their money was welcome, but these were hardened men who had survived harsh winters and deadly encounters. They trusted no one and were quick to draw their weapons if they felt threatened. Most innkeepers considered them difficult customers. Yet, the Fletcher brothers seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to handle even the most grizzled merchants. Men who arrived at the Blackthorn Inn with suspicion and hostility would, a few hours later, leave with laughter, clapping the brothers on the back, clutching detailed hand-drawn maps and advice on the safest routes home. What the community never understood was that the Fletcher brothers had spent their first year in Virginia not building a business, but something far more valuable, a network of information and corruption that would turn their inn into the center of the most lucrative criminal empire the Appalachians had ever seen. The first sign that something was deeply wrong appeared in the autumn of 1749, when a native woman named Flying Leaf, who regularly traded herbs for goods, reported a disturbing conversation she overheard at the Blackthorn Inn. It was a late afternoon in October as Flying Leaf made her way down the path behind the inn, a bundle of ginseng root in her arms. The cool air carried the scent of damp leaves and smoke from the stone chimney. As she neared the kitchen door, she heard voices from within. Angus's thick Scottish accent mingled with a rough, unfamiliar voice. "The Dutchman, Van Horn," the stranger said, "left here 3 days ago with enough silver to buy a plantation. He took the Shadow Ridge Trail, like you suggested. He should be out of the mountains by now, but my men haven't seen a sign of him." Angus's reply sent an involuntary shiver down Flying Leaf's spine. "Oh, that trail is treacherous, especially for a man alone. It's a wild country. Anything can happen. Wild beasts, an Indian attack, or a slip of the foot. Who can say? But it's too much of a coincidence," the stranger growled. "Every time you point someone down that path, they disappear. Here, watch your mouth." Malcolm's deep, cold voice cut in, the threatening tone making Flying Leaf step back. "Are you questioning our arrangements? If so, perhaps you should take this concern to Magistrate Hawthorne. I'm sure he'd be very interested in what you have to say." A silence fell, as heavy as a threat. When the stranger spoke again, his voice was smaller, tinged with fear. No need for that. It's just, seems like too much bad luck happens on that road." "Bad luck follows fools," Angus replied, his cheerful tone returning. "Now, about your share." Flying Leaf slipped away quietly, forgetting her herbs, her mind in a turmoil. But who could she tell? Magistrate Elias Hawthorne was a regular guest at the inn. The British soldiers were stationed too far away. And what had she really heard? Only words thick with insinuation. She decided to remain silent, a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, because within a month, 2 more merchants would vanish on the Shadow Ridge Trail, and the fearful whispers in the settlements would slowly turn into real panic. The script was always the same. A merchant, usually traveling alone or with a single attendant, would stop at the Blackthorn Inn. They would spend a few hours drinking and talking with the brothers, inquiring about the state of the roads. Angus would invariably recommend the Shadow Ridge Trail as a fantastic shortcut, saving a full day's travel. The Fletchers would provide a hand-drawn map, marking safe places to camp, and sell them provisions at a friendly price. The merchants would leave in high spirits, grateful for the innkeeper's kindness, and then they would disappear without a trace, as if swallowed by the forest. By the winter of 1750, the disappearances had become too frequent to ignore. Abigail Whitaker, the widow of a merchant, began her own investigation after her son, Benjamin, failed to return to their Virginia home as planned. Benjamin had written from Pennsylvania, saying he would be traveling through the Appalachians in November and expected to be home before Christmas. When the new year came with no word, Abigail began making inquiries along the route her son had taken. All trails eventually led to the Blackthorn Inn. Yes, the Fletcher brothers remembered Benjamin, a fine young gentleman, they said, very bright and well-spoken. He had left their inn in mid-November, heading south on the Shadow Ridge Trail. Angus even produced a detailed map, showing the exact route he had advised Benjamin to take, carefully marked in ink. "Those mountains are treacherous," Angus explained to Abigail, his face a mask of sincere concern. "We advised him to wait for a larger wagon train, but he was eager to get home. Said his mother was waiting." Malcolm nodded gravely. "I told him to stick to the main road to be safe, even if it was longer. But he was afraid of bandits on the busier routes. He thought the trail would be safer." Abigail left the inn more confused than before. The brothers' story was plausible. Their concern seemed genuine, and it appeared they had tried to help her son. But something felt wrong. A feeling of unease she couldn't name that compelled her to return to the inn twice more in the following months, each time hoping to find a contradiction in their story. She never did. The Fletcher brothers were too careful for such a mistake. As the ice thawed and spring of 1751 arrived, the settlements between Philadelphia and the Virginia frontier began to notice an alarming trend. The number of merchants reported missing along the routes through the Appalachians was rising at an alarming rate. More notably, the disappearances seemed to be concentrated around a specific area, the network of trails branching off the main road, right near the Fletcher Brothers' Blackthorn Inn. The response from the local colonial authorities was virtually non-existent. Magistrate Elias Hawthorne, the highest power in the region, publicly blamed the general lawlessness of the frontier. "We have deserters, bandit gangs, and hostile tribes lurking in these mountains," he would often tell concerned citizens. A lone merchant carrying silver is practically offering his life to fate. That is the grim reality here. Privately, however, Hawthorne was growing uneasy with the pattern of disappearances, not because he suspected the Fletcher brothers. On the contrary, Angus Fletcher had become one of his most reliable intelligence sources. The Scotsman seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict where trouble would arise, frequently providing Hawthorne with tips that led to the successful arrest of petty criminals. In fact, the Fletcher brothers had helped Hawthorne solve more cases in their 2 years than he had managed in the entire decade prior. They reported suspicious strangers, pointed out where stolen goods were being fenced, and even provided testimony that helped convict a few actual highwaymen. This cooperation had earned them not only Hawthorne's trust, but also his absolute protection. When Abigail Whitaker persisted with questions about her missing son, it was Hawthorne who told her bluntly to stop harassing honest innkeepers with her baseless theories. "Mrs. Whitaker, the Fletcher brothers have done more for the safety and order of this region than anyone," Hawthorne declared during a tense meeting at his residence in the spring of 1751. "They are model citizens. You should accept your tragic loss and leave innocent men in peace. They have helped me uphold the law," Hawthorne continued, his voice condescending. "They have provided information that has prevented attacks, and they have never asked for anything but the right to conduct their business in peace. Madam, I understand your grief, but it does not give you license to slander respectable men with groundless suspicion." Abigail left the magistrate's home that day, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she would find no justice from the local authorities. But she was not the only one searching for answers, and a network of families of the missing was steadily growing. Meanwhile, the Fletcher brothers were expanding their criminal empire in ways that would horrify even the most hardened outlaws. The Blackthorn Inn had become the hub of an information network that stretched from the ports of Philadelphia to the Carolina frontier. Every merchant who stopped provided invaluable intelligence without realizing it: where they came from, where they were going, what cargo they carried, and most importantly, whether they were traveling alone or in a caravan. Angus meticulously recorded every detail, but not in his public ledger. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the wine cellar was a collection of leather journals, a predator's guide to the perfect prey. Each entry contained not just basic information, but sharp psychological analyses that would have impressed a royal spy. Angus had developed an almost scientific method for identifying the most lucrative targets. Merchants traveling alone, who had just completed a major deal, were carrying silver or valuable goods and were headed for a distant colony, meaning their disappearance would not be noticed immediately. But the brothers' criminal genius lay not just in selecting victims, but in the sophisticated support network they had built. The men who carried out the robberies and murders, brutal hunters commanded by Malcolm, were merely the tip of the iceberg. The conspiracy also included smiths to launder the stolen silver, corrupt officials to derail any investigation, and even fake guides who provided false testimony about the dangers of the mountains to cover for them. By the spring of 1751, the Fletcher brothers' operation had become so successful that it actually spurred economic growth for the nearby settlement. The flow of stolen silver and goods, once skillfully laundered through transactions in Williamsburg, provided capital for new workshops, funded the construction of a chapel, and even paid for the hiring of the region's first schoolteacher. The bitter irony was that this blood-soaked prosperity gave the Fletcher brothers an almost unassailable reputation. They were seen as pillars of the community. They donated generously to public causes, hired locals to work at the inn, and were always polite and helpful to those around them. Yet, behind this respectable facade, the murders continued with frightening regularity. Each one was planned and executed with the precision of a calculated hunt, leaving no trail that could lead back to the Blackthorn Inn. The investigation that would finally bring down the Fletcher brothers' network of crime began not with a magistrate or a patrol of soldiers, but with the iron resolve of a widowed mother, determined to find the truth about her lost son. Abigail Whittaker was the wife of a respected merchant who had died of fever, leaving her to raise their only son, Benjamin, on a small Virginia plantation. When Benjamin turned 22, he entered the lucrative but risky frontier fur trade, despite his mother's anxieties. He promised to make just one trip to earn enough money to expand the family farm and settle down. Benjamin kept his promise to return, sending his mother a letter from Pennsylvania in the autumn of 1750, describing his plans to travel home through the Appalachians. He had a successful trip, carrying silver and goods worth nearly £5,000, enough to realize all his dreams. The letter was filled with joy for the future and gratitude for the mother whose hard work had raised him. When Benjamin didn't arrive by Christmas as promised, Abigail initially assumed he might have been delayed by harsh weather in the mountains or had joined another caravan taking a longer route. But as weeks turned into months with no word, she made a decision that would become the key to exposing the Fletcher brothers' conspiracy. She would travel to the frontier herself and retrace the exact path her son had intended to take. Abigail Whittaker was no typical frail gentlewoman. Her husband's business had taught her bookkeeping, the analysis of trade routes, and how to systematically gather information. She understood the dangers of the frontier and knew how not to become an easy target. She was accustomed to handling complex ledgers and business correspondence, which gave her valuable experience in systematically collecting and analyzing information. When she arrived in the Appalachian frontier in the spring of 1751, she was meticulously prepared, carrying copies of contracts, detailed maps, and a methodical plan of inquiry. Unlike others who had simply cried and appealed helplessly to the magistrate, Abigail approached her investigation like a merchant tracking a lost shipment. She began by visiting every inn and trading post along Benjamin's route, carrying a miniature portrait of her son and a detailed description of his appearance and his goods. At each stop, she carefully recorded every account, noting the slightest contradictions and gathering information about other missing merchants. A pattern, both clear and terrifying, began to emerge. Many remembered Benjamin Whittaker. He was a polite, intelligent young man who always asked detailed questions about the road conditions and paid his bills promptly. But after leaving the Blackthorn Inn in mid-November 1750, he had vanished completely. When Abigail finally reached the Blackthorn Inn in April, she was almost certain it was the last place her son was seen alive. What she didn't anticipate was how thoroughly the Fletcher brothers had prepared for her questions. Angus Fletcher greeted her warmly, expressed deep sympathy for her loss, and immediately produced a ledger showing detailed notes of Benjamin's visit. According to his records, Benjamin had arrived in mid-November, bought some extra provisions, and spent several hours discussing the route south. Angus insisted that he himself had advised Benjamin to take the main road, specifically warning him about the dangers of shortcuts through the untamed mountains. "Your son was a fine young man, Mrs. Whittaker," Angus told her, his Scottish accent laced with sympathy. "Reminded me of my own nephew back home. I tried to convince him to wait for a larger wagon train, but he was too eager to get to his mother, said he had promises to keep." Malcolm even produced a marked map, indicating the longer, safer main road they claimed to have suggested to Benjamin. They even provided the names of a few other travelers who were at the inn that day and could confirm their story. Abigail left the inn, outwardly impressed by the brothers' concern and their meticulous records, but a feeling of unease gnawed at her, something profoundly wrong that she couldn't yet name. It wasn't until she was half a day's ride away that the horrifying realization struck her. Angus Fletcher knew far too much about her son's private circumstances, details that Benjamin, a naturally cautious person, would never have revealed to a stranger. How did Angus know Benjamin was an only child? How did he know about the promise to buy more land for the plantation? And most importantly, how did he know the silver Benjamin carried was worth nearly £5,000? A figure that Abigail herself had only recently estimated and had not mentioned to anyone during her investigation. That night, in a shabby inn room, Abigail Whitaker made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to her plantation with haunting questions, she would remain on the frontier and conduct the investigation the local magistrate had clearly refused to perform. She rented a small room in a nearby settlement and began her own intelligence campaign. Using the management and analytical skills she had learned from her husband, she created detailed files on every missing merchant case she could find, mapping the points of disappearance, tracking the patterns, and building a comprehensive picture of what she was now certain was an organized criminal network. Abigail's investigation benefited from several factors. As a respectable widow, she was not seen as a threat, which made the men she spoke to, from other innkeepers to hunters, more forthcoming. Her business experience had taught her how to spot lies and inconsistencies in stories. Most importantly, she had the financial means and the patience to conduct a thorough, systematic investigation rather than the cursory inquiries that had satisfied Magistrate Hawthorne. By the end of 1751, Abigail had documented over 20 cases of merchants who had vanished along routes suggested by the Blackthorn Inn. More significantly, she identified a clear pattern among the victims. They were always men traveling alone or in small groups, carrying significant wealth, and heading to a distant colony, which meant their disappearance would not be discovered for a long time. But Abigail's most crucial discovery came from an unexpected source. It was a conversation with a Scottish immigrant woman named Elspeth, who worked as a cook for an official's family in Williamsburg. Elspeth had grown up in the same remote Highland village as the Fletcher brothers. She possessed information that could utterly destroy them, but she was terrified to reveal it. During a chance encounter with Abigail at a Williamsburg market in early 1752, Elspeth overheard her mention the Fletchers' names. When Abigail expressed a desire to learn more about their origins, Elspeth's demeanor changed abruptly. "Those two," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "They are not who they seem. In Scotland, they were known by different names and a fearsome reputation. Mrs. Whitaker. There are stories about those brothers that would freeze your blood." According to Elspeth, the men calling themselves Angus and Malcolm Fletcher were actually named Angus and Malcolm MacLeod. They had fled the Scottish Highlands in 1747 after being suspected of involvement in a series of brutal robberies targeting tax collectors on remote mountain roads. The local authorities had nearly captured them when they vanished, presumably boarding a ship to the New World under assumed names. "My father was a watchman in the region at the time," Elspeth explained during a secret meeting at Abigail's lodging. "He said the MacLeod brothers had a system. They would find out who was carrying money, then arrange for their men to ambush them in the lonely passes. The victims were usually killed on the spot, whether they resisted or not." This information provided Abigail with a crucial piece of the puzzle. The Fletcher brothers were not opportunistic criminals who had stumbled into murder. They were professional killers who had fled Scotland to escape punishment for identical crimes. Their operation in Virginia was essentially a recreation and refinement of the techniques they had mastered back home. But Elspeth's revelations came at a terrible price. Within a week of sharing this information with Abigail, she vanished from the servants' quarters in Williamsburg. Her employer reported that she had left abruptly in the night, taking nothing but the clothes on her back. No one in the Scottish community knew where she had gone, and she was never seen again. Abigail knew instantly that Elspeth's disappearance was directly connected to their conversation. Somehow, the Fletcher brothers had learned of the cook's disclosure and had acted swiftly to silence her. This meant that Abigail's investigation was no longer a secret, and she herself was now in mortal danger. But instead of retreating in fear, Abigail Whitaker made a decision that demonstrated extraordinary courage and sharp strategic thinking. If the local magistrate couldn't or wouldn't investigate the Fletcher brothers, she would present the colonial governor with evidence so irrefutable, so overwhelming, that he would have no choice but to act. The key to building a solid case, Abigail realized, lay in following the trail of the stolen assets. Every murder committed by the Fletcher network involved the theft of a large amount of silver and valuable goods. That property had to be sold or converted into currency somehow, and that process would leave a trail a persistent investigator could follow. Abigail began spending time in the markets and ports of Williamsburg, visiting silversmiths, fur merchants, and goods agents under the guise of a widow looking to invest her inheritance. What she discovered was a complex network of transactions, all revolving around Elias Hawthorne, the respectable magistrate, and a prominent Williamsburg silversmith named Silas Croft. Abigail learned that Croft had been acquiring an unusually large amount of raw silver and furs, often in quantities that far exceeded what the small-scale hunters and traders he claimed as his sources could possibly supply. More importantly, many of Croft's largest transactions suspiciously coincided with the dates that wealthy merchants had disappeared near the Blackthorn Inn. But Abigail's investigation into Croft's activities uncovered an even more horrifying truth. The silversmith was just one link in a chain that included some of the most influential figures in the Virginia colony. The stolen silver and goods were being systematically laundered through legitimate businesses, with the profits divided among a group that included wealthy merchants, ship captains, and even officials on the colonial council. This discovery explained everything. It explained why the disappearances were always ignored and why Magistrate Hawthorne so fiercely defended the Fletcher brothers. They were not merely operating under the nose of a corrupt official. They were a core part of a conspiracy whose tentacles reached the highest levels of power in the Virginia colony. Just when it seemed she had reached the bottom of the depravity, the Virginia conspiracy revealed even darker layers. If this story is making you reflect, share it with your friends who love history and hidden mysteries. Let's find out what happens next in Abigail Whittaker's perilous investigation. By February 1752, Abigail had compiled a dossier that not only documented the disappearances, but also exposed the entire economic system that made the crimes profitable. Her evidence included copies of transaction ledgers, testimony from anonymous witnesses, and even sketches of personal items she had found during secret searches along the Shadow Ridge Trail. But Abigail understood that all this evidence would be worthless if it fell into the wrong hands. The local officials were either part of the conspiracy or too afraid to oppose it. She needed to find someone with real power, someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or influenced by the colony's corrupt network. Her solution was to approach Governor Robert Dinwiddie, the highest representative of the British Crown in Virginia, whom she knew had an underlying friction with many local officials. She also reached out to an old friend of her husband's, Colonel George Washington, a rising young officer in the Virginia militia known for his integrity and his hatred of the lawlessness on the frontier. She believed he was the only one with the courage and authority to investigate such an explosive case. The letter Abigail sent to Colonel Washington in early March 1752 was a masterpiece of clarity and caution. Instead of making bald accusations, she presented her evidence systematically, allowing the colonel to draw his own conclusions about the scale and nature of the conspiracy. She attached copies of ledgers, coded witness statements, and detailed maps showing the undeniable link between the disappearances and the advice from the Blackthorn Inn. Washington's response was immediate and decisive. He would personally lead a small militia detachment to the frontier to investigate Abigail's claims, but she must take extreme care to ensure her own safety until his arrival. The young officer understood, even from Abigail's cautious prose, that she had uncovered something far more dangerous than any simple band of robbers. But the Fletcher brothers had their own eyes and ears within the colonial administration. Through Magistrate Hawthorne, they learned of Washington's planned investigation just days after he received the letter. The network that had protected them for years began to mobilize to eliminate the threat. Their objective was clear. Neither the troublesome militia colonel nor the persistent widow who refused to accept her fate could be allowed to survive. Colonel George Washington arrived at the frontier settlement in late March 1752. He was accompanied by only a few trusted soldiers, disguised as a land survey party to avoid alerting the local authorities. His first meeting with Abigail Whittaker took place in a dilapidated warehouse behind the chapel, where the local pastor had agreed to provide a safe location. What Abigail presented during the nearly 3-hour meeting went far beyond Washington's worst imaginings of the criminal conspiracy's extent. Her meticulously documented evidence revealed not just a series of murders, but a sophisticated criminal empire that had corrupted officials and generated enormous profits. Washington was particularly astonished by Abigail's discovery of the financial network. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said, his voice filled with admiration as he reviewed her ledgers, "what you have exposed here is not mere robbery and murder. This is organized crime on a scale I have never seen in this colony. They have essentially created an entire shadow economy built on blood and deceit." But Washington was also keenly aware of the danger Abigail's investigation had brought upon them both. The Fletcher network included Magistrate Hawthorne, and news of his presence had almost certainly reached their ears. The only solution was to act quickly and with surprise, launching simultaneous raids on multiple locations before they could react. In the pre-dawn hours of an early April day in 1752, Washington's militia simultaneously raided the Blackthorn Inn, Silas Croft's silversmith shop, and the residence of Magistrate Elias Hawthorne. What they found at the Blackthorn Inn would haunt these militiamen for the rest of their lives. Hidden under the loose floorboard in the wine cellar that Abigail had suspected, they discovered not only the leather-bound ledgers detailing over 80 victims, but also physical evidence that told a story of systematic murder spanning years. The secret cellar was filled with the personal effects of dozens of victims, pocket watches, silver rings, crumpled letters from home, and mementos that painted a heartbreaking picture of merchants on their way back to families they would never see again. But the most chilling discovery was Angus Fletcher's detailed notes, describing the psychological techniques he used to identify lucrative prey and lure them onto the paths of death. One particularly cold entry, dated autumn 1750, described Benjamin Whitaker in the detached terms of a hunter, young man from Virginia, a widow's son, returning from Pennsylvania, carrying silver and furs worth approx. £5,000, traveling alone, anxious to get home, no other relatives likely to investigate immediately. Suggested Shadow Ridge Trail, resting spot at Whispering Falls. Notified Malcolm and the hunters for November 15, but the most damning evidence was Angus's meticulous financial ledgers, which recorded exactly how the profits from each murder were distributed among the network's members. Magistrate Elias Hawthorne received 10% of the stolen assets from every victim. Silas Croft, the silversmith, took a large cut for laundering the stolen silver. Even a member of the Colonial Council in Williamsburg received monthly tributes, totaling far more than his official salary. The raid on Croft's silversmith shop exposed the entire sophisticated money laundering operation, the foundation that made the murders so profitable. Croft melted down the stolen silver, casting it into legal ingots, then used the profits to invest in merchant ships, both to hide the money's origins and to generate a steady return for all the conspirators. Meanwhile, a search of the Shadow Ridge Trail yielded horrifying physical evidence that confirmed Abigail's theories. At Whispering Falls, where Benjamin Whitaker was believed to have made camp, soldiers found personal items buried in shallow graves, along with human remains showing clear signs of a violent death. But the most shocking discovery came from the arrest of Magistrate Elias Hawthorne. In a secret drawer beneath his desk, they found detailed correspondence with Angus Fletcher dating back to 1749, revealing that Hawthorne was not just taking bribes to look the other way. He was an active participant in planning the attacks. One letter from Angus to Hawthorne, dated January 1752, read, "The Whitaker widow has not given up. Her son was one of our most profitable ventures, and she seems determined to find the truth. Perhaps it is time she had a reunion with her son on the Shadow Ridge Trail. Persistent types like her rarely stop on their own, and she is becoming a real danger to our entire operation." Hawthorne's reply was equally chilling. "I agree on the Whitaker matter, but murdering a prominent widow will draw attention from the governor's office. Better to arrange an accident on her journey home. Make it look like a native attack. I can provide details of her route." These letters made it clear that Abigail Whitaker had been living under a death sentence for months, her life saved only by her decision to remain on the frontier to continue her investigation, rather than returning home as the killers had anticipated. As news of the arrest spread throughout the Virginia colony, the true scale of the Fletcher conspiracy came into focus. The network included not only direct participants like Hawthorne and Croft, but also dozens of seemingly respectable citizens who had profited from blood money, merchants who bought and sold stolen goods, ship captains who transported them, and officials who took bribes to ignore all signs of wrongdoing. The economic impact of the conspiracy's collapse was immediate and severe. Several Williamsburg businesses faced bankruptcy as their ties to the illicit assets were exposed. The credibility of the Colonial Council was severely damaged, forcing the governor to undertake a sweeping reform. Even the settlement's chapel fund was frozen when investigators revealed that a significant portion had come from donations made with the profits from murder. But the most horrifying revelations came from Angus Fletcher himself during his interrogation by royal officials. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the prospect of the gallows, he confessed everything, revealing the true scale of the criminal operation. Between 1748 and 1752, the Fletcher network had murdered more than 80 people along the routes through the Appalachians. The victims had been carrying a combined fortune of over £200,000, a staggering sum at the time. The murders were planned and executed with the precision of a hunt, using an information network as sophisticated as any spy organization. "We were not common highwaymen," Angus explained to the investigators, his voice not trembling but tinged with pride. "Robbers are crude and impulsive, risking their necks for small gains. We were businessmen who understood that information is more valuable than gunpowder, and that a systematic plan eliminates risk while maximizing profit." Malcolm Fletcher's confession was less articulate but no less chilling. He described the murders with the professional detachment of a hunter recounting his kills. Most victims were dispatched quickly and efficiently, often by henchmen skilled in violence but completely unknown to the victim. The murders were disguised as native attacks or accidents, the bodies hidden in caves or ravines to make discovery nearly impossible. But the brothers' confession also revealed a truth that horrified the investigators. The Fletcher network was not unique. They had been in contact and exchanged information with similar criminal groups in other colonies like Pennsylvania and Carolina, sharing techniques and sometimes even collaborating on larger ventures. The murder of merchants for their property was becoming an organized criminal industry, with networks stretching across the colonial frontier. The trial of the members of the Fletcher conspiracy began in Williamsburg in 1753, drawing the attention of the entire colony to what the press dubbed the Blackthorn Inn robbers. The evidence presented by Abigail Whitaker and Colonel Washington exposed a level of criminal sophistication that shocked even the most seasoned magistrates. Angus and Malcolm Fletcher were convicted on more than 80 counts of murder and executed by hanging on a summer day in 1753. The execution drew a large crowd, many of them relatives of the victims who came to see justice done. Even facing death, Angus Fletcher showed no remorse. He reportedly told the pastor, "We gave those men a quick death, which is a mercy this wilderness seldom grants." Magistrate Elias Hawthorne and 10 other key conspirators received life sentences in an English prison. Silas Croft and other members of the network were sentenced to years of hard labor. The trials exposed the full extent of the corrupt network and brought a painful resolution to families who had waited years for news of their loved ones. The trials laid bare the entire web of corruption and brought agonizing answers to families who had lived in hope and despair for years. Abigail Whitaker became a model of courage and persistence in the colony. She was celebrated throughout Virginia for her determination and sharp investigative skills. The governor offered her a large reward and a land grant, but she declined, choosing to return to her plantation to live a quiet life. But Abigail's victory came at an immense personal cost. She had found the truth about her son's death, but the truth brought no peace. Benjamin Whitaker had died a brutal, lonely death. His dreams of a family and a bright future had been crushed by men who saw him as nothing more than an entry in a ledger. The details of Benjamin's final hours, revealed in Angus Fletcher's confession, would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Fletcher case also exposed the fragility of the trade routes and the lax security on the frontier. The British colonial authorities responded by increasing military patrols along the main roads and establishing a more effective communications system between settlements, allowing forces to coordinate their response to threats. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Fletcher conspiracy was the questions it raised about trust and human nature in a fledgling society. The network had survived for years, not just through violence, but primarily through the brothers' ability to cultivate a respectable, helpful facade. They weaponized trust, the natural human tendency to believe those who appear kind, turning it into a tool to identify and murder their victims. The Blackthorn Inn was burned to the ground by the military after the investigation concluded, as if to erase the stain. But Devil's Fork Crossroads, where it once stood, was avoided by merchants and travelers for decades, becoming a landmark associated with gruesome legends. Locals reported feeling an indescribable unease whenever they passed the overgrown plot of land. Whether it was due to restless spirits or simply the psychological impact of the horrific story remains a mystery. The detailed records of the Fletcher case, sealed by the colonial government, remain largely archived in England to this day. Some historians believe this secrecy was due to the involvement of high-ranking officials and fears of uncovering similar criminal networks in other colonies. The full scale of organized crime targeting merchants in colonial America may never be fully known. Decades later, in the late 18th century, as new settlers pushed westward, they discovered numerous caves containing human remains along the old Shadow Ridge Trail. Personal items found with them matched descriptions of missing merchants, confirming that even the Fletcher brothers' detailed confessions had not accounted for all their victims. The discovery of more victims years after the brothers' deaths raised disturbing questions. Had they been operating for longer than anyone thought? Were there other members of the network who had escaped and continued their crimes elsewhere? Abigail Whittaker died peacefully in 1785, taking many of the secrets of her investigation to her grave. Her personal notes, kept by her family, show that she continued to track suspicious disappearances in other colonies until the end of her life. She was convinced that the Fletcher network was just one part of a much larger criminal conspiracy spanning the American frontier. Among her papers are notes on patterns of disappearances in Carolina and Pennsylvania that mirrored the Virginia case in disturbing detail. The final mystery of the Fletcher case lies not in what was discovered, but in what remains hidden. Investigators estimated they murdered over 80 people, but Angus Fletcher's ledgers hinted at an even higher number. In his final confession, he alluded to special arrangements for politically high-value targets, but was executed before he could reveal the details. Modern historians believe the Fletcher brothers may have been responsible for the disappearance of several important figures of the era, including an envoy from the Pennsylvania government and a wealthy landowner, deaths that were never officially linked to them. Devil's Fork Crossroads was eventually bypassed by newer roads, and today the site of the Blackthorn Inn is nothing more than an empty clearing, reclaimed by the dense forest. The local people of Appalachia still tell their children whispered stories of the Fletcher brothers, making them a part of the region's folklore. Some believe the spirits of the victims still roam the old trails, warning travelers. Others insist that descendants of the criminal network still live in the area, maintaining a code of silence passed down through generations. But perhaps the most frightening aspect of the Fletcher case is how easily it could be repeated. The brothers succeeded not through supernatural power or exceptional criminal talent, but through meticulous observation, systematic planning, and the ruthless exploitation of social trust. They identified vulnerable prey, created plausible scenarios for their disappearances, and built a network of corruption that made investigation nearly impossible. This case is a profound reminder that evil often hides behind a mask of respectability, and that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who appear the most helpful and trustworthy. In a world where people still rely on the kindness of strangers during long journeys, the lesson of the Blackthorn Inn remains disturbingly relevant. The legacy of the Fletcher brothers lives on in the vigilance authorities now apply to disappearances along desolate routes, in the folk tales passed down through generations, and in the necessary skepticism we should have for offers that seem too good to be true. But their most enduring legacy is perhaps the questions the case raises about the nature of community and trust. How many other criminal networks operated in the chaos of the colonial era? How many missing merchants were victims of organized conspiracies rather than random violence? And, most frightening of all, how many similar operations continue today, hidden behind respectable facades and shielded by networks of corruption that make them nearly impossible to detect? This mystery shows us that the most horrific crimes are often those hidden in plain sight, carried out by people who seem ordinary, friendly, and trustworthy. The Fletcher brothers succeeded for years not because they were criminal geniuses, but because they understood that most people want to believe in the goodness of others. They weaponized that trust, turning it into a tool to identify and murder innocent travelers whose only crime was to seek help from a stranger. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the whole truth about the Blackthorn Inn conspiracy has been revealed? The fact that the case files remain partially sealed to this day suggests that the colonial authorities may have discovered connections and evidence deemed too sensitive to make public. Share your thoughts and theories about what really happened in those treacherous Appalachian mountains. History holds countless dark secrets, and we will continue to uncover them together. Until next time, always remember, the most dangerous people are often the ones who seem most eager to help you.